Test, test. Here we go. Good morning, everybody. So sorry for the slightly late start this morning. Welcome to the DSE Jaipur Literature Festival. We're so happy to have you here in the Google Moogle tent. My name is Laura MacDonald, and I am going to be venue managing this venue over the next 5 days, and it's just wonderful to have you here. I would like to just do a couple of very quick housekeeping points. Basically, if you could just not leave any bags unattended at any time, we'd be so grateful for that. That's a security risk and it's for your safety. Please put your phones on silent. If you have an urgent discussion, please take it away and outside away from the authors. That would be very kind. No flash photography is allowed. And if you could just help us keep the aisles free and keep the venue clean, we'd be so grateful. We've got a great team here helping us. Now, one thing that I just have to do, because it's so important to actually list the people that have helped us get here, is just acknowledge our sponsors. So if you'll just indulge me for just a second, I just have to read out the list of people who we're very grateful for helping us bring the DSC Jaipur Literature Festival to you. So thank you to DSC, Tata Steel, Google, Airtel, Coca-Cola, Rajasthan Tourism, Councilage, Public Diplomacy, ICCR, Incredible India, Glenlivet, Nine Hills, Vodafone, Rajasthan Patrika, The Hindu, DNA, Dainik Bhaskar, Hindustan Times, Directorate of Film Festivals, the Foundation of Jan Michalski, Harvard University Press, American Center, Penguin, British Council, and the hotels ITC, Oberoi, Taj, Samod, Clark's, Amer, and of course Diggy. We're so happy to be here. Westland, Canada Council for the Arts, the Australia-India Council, the Italian Cultural Centre, the Instituto Cervantes, Institut Français, Kingfisher, Yatra Books, the State Bank of Bikaner and Jaipur, Avid Learning, Ambuja Neotya Group, Edinburgh World Writers' Conference and the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and finally the National Book Trust, Rajasthan Royals, Royal Gems, McCann World Group, Britannia, Prabha Kaitan Foundation, and finally DLF. Thank you so much for your indulgence. I did it. Okay, now it's time to kick off this session. The Global Shakespeare. We're so excited to have these wonderful authors here for you for our first session. I'd like to start by introducing our moderator, Supriya Nair, and then we have, in alphabetical order, Elif Batuman, we have Chandrahas Choudhury, Anjum Hasan, we have Christopher Ricks, and finally Tim Supple. Thank you so much.
Hello? Keep them entertained. Hi. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to, sorry, was that too loud? And welcome to the Global Shakespeare. We are here to talk about the glorious afterlife of William Shakespeare, international man of letters. And as it happens, this is a particularly good year to do that. Although he's had about 400 years of an exalted, sort of posthumous career, I think in the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen, such wonders as the Globe to Globe season at the World Shakespeare Festival, which had, sort of this astonishing project of putting on all 37 plays in 37 different languages, with, different troupes from sort of different parts of the world, including Atul Kumar's 12th Night, Pia Behrupia, which some of you might have seen. What else? The Olympics opening ceremony, which was seen by billions of people, arguably took Shakespeare as its spiritual guide. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, and so on. Two major Hollywood adaptations with Ray Fiennes' Coriolanus and Joss Whedon, that most Shakespearean of directors, doing Much Ado About Nothing, and so on and so forth. But with all this, global and one of the things I'd like to start with is what it means for us to see this writer as global, as universal, or as democratic, which are all words we apply to Shakespeare with regularity. Professor Riggs, what do you make of this?
The word, will this work? Ah, yes, thank you. The word global is large, and some places now want to say universal, because global doesn't seem big enough. What we know is that Shakespeare is read for pleasure, performed with delight, studied with pleasure, and is an extraordinarily creative force, not only in his own work, but in other people's creations. So globally, I would just say that if Ezra Pound was right to say that the most important criticism of any work of art is a subsequent creation, then it is part of Shakespeare's greatness that Turgenev wrote a Lear of the Steppes, which is the greatest act of criticism ever brought to bear on King Lear. Or the Lady Macbeth of the Matsents district, which is an extraordinary work of appreciative new creation based on Shakespeare. Or T.S. Eliot's two poems, Coriolan, as the greatest criticism that Coriolanus has ever received. So that seems to me to be global, and it is continuing the new creativity, which I think must be an essential part of Shakespeare's genius.
Thank you. You know, Professor Riggs, I wonder also if sort of there's some kind of, what do you think is this transitive quality of Shakespeare's, you know, that migrates not just through time, but also through geographies? As you know, he's been sort of adapted and translated and loved in various languages throughout the world. What I also find of note is that, you know, there's probably no theatre-going culture in the world today who says, oh my God, Two Gentlemen of Verona, which means that, you know, there's some sense of greatness in the best plays that filters through. Mm-hmm. Could we perhaps have a stab at what that might be?
He is the greatest prose writer as well as the greatest poet in the English language. And that matters because of the age-old tendency to pretend that poetry is the greatest use of language. All poets will tell you that the greatest literature is poetry, and Coleridge told you that prose is the words in the best order, and poetry is the best words in the best order. Now, nobody ever used words better than Jane Austen, or I gather Tolstoy, though I read him only in English, and many of the greatest things in Shakespeare are in prose. When Shylock says, hath not a Jew eyes, it's very important that speech is not poetry. It's very important that the most humanly touching moment in Hamlet, just before the duel, is in prose. You will lose this wager, my lord. I do not think so. Since he went into France, I have been in continual practice. I shall win at the odds, but thou wouldst not think how ill all's here about my heart. But it is no matter. Now, you couldn't possibly have a greater use of language than that, and I think it's part of Shakespeare's greatness, or ought to be, that it would defy the self-serving publicity by poets that they are the only real literature that we should care about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Elif, some of this universal quality of Shakespeare's happened to be a subject of yours when you wrote recently about a women's theatre group in rural Turkey who, among other things, had translated and staged Hamlet. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that? And maybe talk about, you know, you got your hands on the translation itself also, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this picking up? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I wrote a piece for The New Yorker in the December 27th issue, I think, about a women's theater group in the Taurus Mountains of Turkey. And it was started by a woman who first saw theater for the first time in her village square. She saw a high school play when she was, I think, 45 years old. And she decided that she made it her life's goal from that point to express the problem, the unexpressed problem of the human condition of village women through theater, through plays about their lives. But so there's like, she had two projects. One was sort of self-expression and self-representation and a kind of almost therapy. And the other program was giving voice to village women and having village women be taken seriously. And to that end, she put on Hamlet. So most of the plays she writes herself based on true stories of herself and her friends. The group is all women. And this is in a, not a super conservative part of Turkey, but a far from cities in the mountains, remote. So it's an extraordinary achievement. And when I first heard that she had staged Hamlet, which she called Hamit, she changed the names so that they would be more easier for a Turkish audience. Horatio became Hurşit. They all had these Turkish names. And all the women played the roles themselves, wearing these very large mustaches that they made out of goat hair. And when I first heard about it, I thought it sounded a little bit gimmicky. But when I met her and I saw them stage little parts of it, and especially when I reread Hamlet, I saw how, Hamlet is so huge and so global that you can find anyone's story in it that you're looking, maybe not anyone, but you could certainly find the story of the village women. I didn't realize until I reread it how much of it was about, how the metaphors for suicide are all about the difficulty of farming, and then the pointlessness of life is all, you weed the garden and then, you have to do it again. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. The Turkish Hamlet. There was a lot that came through. And then I saw that she chose it for a reason, and that particularly the question of whether to be alive or to be dead, which is something that, my intellectual friends in the United States talk about a lot, it was still more present and more real in this village in Turkey, that there was actually, one of the women had a line in one of the plays that the women wrote themselves, where she talks about coming back from the hospital after a very difficult birth, and she has to kind of hitchhike back in the snow. It's February, everything's under 10 meters of snow. And she's gathering wood for the fire to heat the baby's bath. And then she thinks, why couldn't I just have died in the hospital? And then when I was rereading To Be or Not to Be, that there's that line, who would these fardels bear to, it's exactly that. It's the exact thought that she had about gathering firewood is really difficult, and which could sound like a trivial and superficial connection, but I think it was actually very deep, and this question of whether to be alive or not, and whether to keep living in the face of futility, and how to make meaning through theater was a real connection that she picked up on, and that's why she staged that play.
What was the translation itself like? Was it all in prose, or?
It was in prose. It was she was actually so she would work 12 hours in the I think she was planting broccoli at the time when she was working. So she would get on a bus and plant broccoli with her friends for 12 hours, and then take the bus back home and not translate Shakespeare. She was working from a Turkish translation, but she wanted it to be comprehensible to village people, so she simplified it. And yeah, it doesn't sound quite the way normal people talk, but it's more, she replaced some of the kind of fancier Persian words that are in the standard Turkish translation with more the way that people would speak.
Okay, brilliant. Moving from Turkey to India. Tim, you performed this sort of extraordinary act of transcreation when you staged Midsummer Night's Dream in India in 2007. In not one but several Indian languages. Could you talk a little bit about bringing the dream to India? And I'm particularly interested in what came first. I mean, did you want to do Shakespeare and think, I should do this in India? Or did you come to India and think, oh, this is it. This is the stage I want for the dream?
The production of Midsummer Night's Dream that we created here in India with performers from all over India, from many different theatre traditions and many different languages. That production was a meeting point between two different lines that converged. I came to India to work with Indian artists. I didn't know what I was going to work on. I brought in my suitcase, because this was before Kindle and all of that, big books, Indian stories, traditional and mythological, contemporary Indian literature, my complete works of Shakespeare, and other great works from the global canon, if we can say that, the Greek classics, the classical canon, the works that we commonly think can translate. But when I came to India, and I thought, because I didn't know so much about Indian theatre, I assumed I would work with English-speaking actors and actresses in the big cities. That's what I assumed I was going to do, because that's my idea of an actor. But what really got me excited, I mean, there were some very good English-speaking actors, of course, but what really switched me into a different place were the rural and folk and classical non-English-speaking theatre traditions here, which take you right back to the roots of theatre, and that's important in the connection with Shakespeare, which I'll come back to in a minute. But what hit me like a train was the idea of The Midsummer Night's Dream, because all my life I'd been wanting to produce that play. I'd watched it many times, I'd read it, I'd thought of doing it, but I was rather bored of what can happen in the UK, which, as you probably know, is a very vibrant Shakespearean scene. Of course, it would be. But there's the problem that these plays are done so much, and there's about 6 plays that are really done so much, in which Midsummer Night's Dream is one, King Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth, and so on. They're done so much that if you're a director or an actor, you get very caught in this question of, well, how are you going to do it? Which I think is a very boring question. And if you're doing The Midsummer Night's Dream, people will say, well, how are you going to do the fairies? And then you think, oh, I should do something really interesting with the fairies. Maybe they're punks, or maybe they're Victorian, or maybe they're children. And this is very superficial. But it can happen in the UK because you almost have to mark your card. And now, I wanted to avoid all of that, so I hesitated doing A Midsummer Night's Dream because I didn't want to ruin that experience by producing in that context. And I saw in India, in those performers, I saw the potential to really unlock the dream for me. And I thought that they, the performers, would unlock the dream as a play, and I also thought that the dream would unlock something in them as performers. And so that was the idea. And I just want to say one thing out of interest for this discussion, which is that ours was a very exact translation. We aimed for it to be. When it was prose, we translated it as prose. When it was verse, we translated it as verse. And the task that we set the translators was to try to get as close as possible to the language. And that's very important because it wasn't an adaptation. And for me, the most exciting performance of Midsummer Night's Dream, of all the hundreds of performances we did to thousands of people all over the world, there were some very, very good moments. The first performance in Stratford upon Avon was exhilarating for all of us. But the best event was the rehearsal run-through that we did near Pondicherry in a place called Adishakti, where we rehearsed. And in that rehearsal run-through, there were all the workers from the village who'd helped us through our time. So they were the people that had cooked or cleaned, and their husbands and children. So there was a village audience. Then there was an Oroville audience, and if any of you know Oroville, you know what I mean. But if you don't know Oroville, this is a sort of global, cultural, international audience of the sort of highest expectations of art. And then there was a middle-class audience from the local towns who'd had a connection. We're talking about 60, 70 people, that's all. But in that audience was the Shakespearean range. And I think that what I want to say about that is that something in Shakespeare, deep through the language, deep through the characters, deep through the story, connects to somewhere very deep in the roots of theatre. And I could see that that audience recognized something deep inside that play. So when Bottom turns into an ass, or when Titania and Oberon mess with the human world, there's a recognition, a real reverberation with Indian mythological theatre and Indian mythological stories. When the lovers are fighting with the fathers and running away to the forest to try and find somewhere to rip each other's clothes off, that's a kind of Bollywood reality, but more extreme, more earthy. And when the working people are putting on a play and talking in that incredible prose, bottom and quints and all the working mechanicals, that takes you right to the kind of theatre groups that you'll find in Kolkata today, who are doing one job by day and by night are making theatre. So I think that somewhere there's something almost transparent about Shakespeare, where other cultures and other places and other times can meet him, and we've seen that throughout history.
I love that you say that, particularly the connection with Shakespeare and folk theatre, because sort of, received wisdom is that Shakespeare is deeply connected to modern theatre in India, but mostly, because like starting with the 19th century and sort of musical theatre and performing theatre, which, we got because of garrison theatre from the Englishmen who came down earlier. But it wasn't just the text. I mean, in spite of the fidelity to the text, your dream was also something that grew in process, right? Because you were working with artists from different traditions, aerialists, dancers, musicians. What was that process like? Introducing the play, in some cases, I suppose, to some people.
You mean introducing the play to the artists, in a way? Well, the rehearsals were of necessity a very concentrated process, where we took ourselves away from the world. We went to this place called Adishakti, which is sort of cut off from the rest of the world. We worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, because we all had a very big journey to travel. I mean, not only to make a production of The Midsummer Night's Dream, which is hard enough anyway, but for myself to understand these performers and to understand their languages, for the performers to understand each other, because these were performers, I must stress, who often would never be in the same creative situation. I mean, performers of profoundly different ways of making theatre, and again, speaking different languages. So in order to make one thing, we had to go through many processes, and those processes were equally Indian and from my tradition, and my tradition is firstly about text and fidelity to text, which is not such a big idea in Indian traditional theatre. Some of those performers would not necessarily say the same words every night. Why would they? Nor would they necessarily say the same words that are on the page. I mean, they would improvise, but that's not what we were doing. And that's my tradition, and also in my tradition, of course, is the Stanislavskian idea of an emotional truth, which again was not necessarily what some of the performers that were working on that production would do. So when I suggested at first that the sexual content or the violence had to be in some sense deeply realistic, because that's my tradition, that was a big journey for them to go on. But at the same time, what they brought, which opened up for me a whole other world, and I think we really miss in the West with our productions of Shakespeare, is those Indian performers opened me to the other half of Shakespeare. Shakespeare stands right in the middle between the ancients and the moderns, and I think that might be another clue as to his universality. He's in a sense an ancient writer. He has one foot steeped in ritual, in magical possibilities, in the sort of deep ritualized expression of drama, the abstracted and the sort of Greek ancient and ancient Indian traditions of the masque and the dance and music. And the other half, Shakespeare, of course, is such a modern writer, where he penetrates psychology in the way that Elif was talking about, where he describes processes that meant so much in South Africa or in Eastern Europe or in Russia or in any other time of struggle that we can talk about all over the world. So this ancient and modern side, it's very hard for Western actors and Western directors to touch the ancient. It's very, very hard. We don't really get it. That's why we do the fairies as punks, because it makes more sense to us to keep it modern. And there's no coincidence that the fact that the most successful productions of Shakespeare in the UK today tend to be productions that modernize him, that set him in by modern I mean, post-Elizabethan, that reset him as Victorian or contemporary or so on. There's no coincidence, because we feel more comfortable with that. What these actors did is they opened me up to that other side of Shakespeare, and that's something that I had always felt was there, but it was revelatory to me. to see that possibility. And I think it's every bit as important to why he is, whatever we're going to say, universal or global, is his ability to touch a broader, deeper, higher and lower human reality than the mere present tense, which is only half of the point.
Right. And you're talking about, the modern half of Shakespeare, to sort of simplify things, brings us to how we relate to Shakespeare on the page. And Anjum, you're a novelist, and Shakespeare has this odd presence in both the novels that you've written so far, and you relate to him sort of text to text, right? Would you like to talk a little bit about that and perhaps introduce us to how sort of Shakespeare filters through your character's consciousness?
I think I'd like to start by saying that I adore Shakespeare. He's a writer I really, really love, and we don't often talk about. I think we need to break down Shakespeare a lot today and analyze why he's important, and why does the poetry move us, and why does the prose move us, and why do the plays move us. But I'd like to make it simple by saying I adore Shakespeare, and I think as an Indian writer in English, we don't often talk of influences. We don't talk often of the English writers moving behind our English sentences and our English prose. And I'd like to imagine that Shakespeare, in some sense, moves behind my English. And I think I would say that because I was taught Shakespeare from the time I was 12 in school with a lot of passion, a lot of enthusiasm. And this was a Shakespeare both on the page and performed. So for instance, if I remember a line from Taming of the Shrew, if I be waspish, best beware my sting, I will always remember that line with the echo of the way it was performed on the stage when I was 13 years old. Or Lady Macbeth saying to her husband, "Fie, my lord, fie, a soldier and afraid, what needst we fear?" And then immediately the tenor changes and she says, "And yet, who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him?" So, it is very much Shakespeare on the page, but you also remember, you also remember the cadence. You hear it. So I do hear Shakespeare. And I'm not very good with the stories. I don't really recall what happened when, in which play. I remember the lines. For me, Shakespeare, fortunately or unfortunately, is wonderful lines. Lines that resonate, lines that I wish I could have written. When I started thinking about writing about Shakespeare in my fiction, it was a sort of reversal. I didn't want to necessarily write about a character who adores Shakespeare, admires him, because I think in India, growing up in a particular class, that is taken for granted, I think we all, in some way or the other, do relate to Shakespeare. But what if you reverse that equation and talk of somebody who has a difficult relationship with Shakespeare? And the broader question in my novel, and the novel I'm talking about here is Lunatic in My Head, my first novel, is a teacher's troubled relationship to the English literature that she has to teach. And it's not just Shakespeare. There's Jane Austen, there's Hemingway, and Firdaus, my character, suspects that Hemingway, for instance, is not as profound a writer as he's made out to be. An Old Man and the Sea is really just about a man out at sea trying to catch a fish. And why does she have to spend so much time breaking her head over this novel? So what she has to do in the classroom, it's what I think of as the Humpty Dumpty problem. Teachers of English literature, she thinks to herself, have to pulverize, explain, and then put it all back together again. So how do you put together something that you've pulverized, that you've broken down? And she feels the same way about Shakespeare. And now there's a scene which is particularly about Shakespeare in the novel, and it's to do with the play As You Like It. And in As You Like It, there's a lot of drama, there's comedy, there's marriage, there's love. But there is a very discontented, clever, witty, and yet very sad character called Jacques. And Jacques is always talking in riddles, and Firdaus is the worst possible thing she could be trying to explain to her students. So what I'm trying to do here is take a very difficult passage from Shakespeare and transpose it to an Indian classroom between a teacher who's both in awe of English literature and not quite sure she likes it, and a class of largely indifferent students who would rather be out on dates with boys than sitting and trying to understand what Jacques is saying. For me, in the transposition, there is comedy. I think I was trying to write a funny scene. But yes, there is also a tussle with Shakespeare, a real engagement with what is this man trying to say when he says, invest me in my motley and give me leave to speak my mind, and I will through and through cleanse the foul body of the infected world. What is he really talking about? And the epiphany for Firdaus actually comes much later when she's gone through a crisis. And then she realizes that those words on the page actually do come alive for her, but not in that moment in the classroom. So it is about the difficulty of Shakespeare in the classroom and how do you make sense of him. I also write about Shakespeare in my second novel. Do you want me to talk about that now or later?
Should we come back to it? Because I think...
Yeah.
Since this ties in so nicely with Chandrahas's own work on Lunatic in My Head, I'm just going to ask him to step in here. And Chandrahas, you wrote about this classroom scene in an essay called The Indian Shakespeare, and in which you brilliantly saw the comedy of how generations of school children, particularly in India, have related to Shakespeare. Did that tally with your own classroom experience?
Yes, it did, and that's why actually I responded to the scene so much, because I think Shakespeare's many incarnations, and the Indian Shakespeare is mainly a textual one, in that he's taught to most of us in classrooms and in school and at universities, and most of us don't go to see a Shakespeare play till much later, if ever. And my first encounter with Shakespeare was, I think, when I was 11 or 12, and there was a speech from Hamlet in our school textbook that we were supposed to study, as do many others. Most of you would know what I'm talking about. And, it only struck me many years later when I read the whole play that the speech I'd read in my school book was Polonius' speech to Laertes, giving him advice for his life. Neither borrow nor lender be, and stuff like that. And we were encouraged to take it all extremely seriously and sort of ingest that advice for our own life. It was kind of a recipe for life for young people. And it's only when you read the whole play that you see this is actually Polonius is being made fun of, and it's a whole set of cliches. But I think one of the incarnations of Shakespeare in India is as this great store of quotable quotes about life, philosophy, wisdom, politics, that you can then just a kind of potted guide to life that you can sort of take a few lines out of every play and use them in your life. That's how we see Shakespeare often. Also, there happened to be, and Anjum will know about this, Shakespeare is taken extremely seriously by English departments in India. To the extent that for a very long time, and maybe even today, there was always this one grizzled professor. I don't mean you, Dr. Rix. I mean,
and I don't even have a doctorate.
Yeah, that's right. That's wonderful. Well, you should know that Mr. Rix has written a book on Bob Dylan as poet, so he can't be the sort of figure I'm speaking about. There was in every college department, literature department, the sort of grizzled Shakespearean professor who he had always claimed, and this was kind of legend about him, he'd never read anything other than Shakespeare in his life, and he refused to read, as you say, he refused to read prose. I mean, after Shakespeare, what? Modern novels? I just wouldn't. So, and you had always to be claiming or defending yourself to this person about why you were trying to study other things, and if you said to him you didn't like Shakespeare, I mean, that was the end of it for you.
Right.
I found all of this very interesting and inverted, actually. So we are taught, what I want to say is we're taught this kind of bardolatry that Shakespeare is unquestionably the greatest poet that ever lived, and he's the one we should always study about, which is not good for an appreciation of Shakespeare. I mean, it means that you don't reach him on your own terms, and you end up resenting him. In the same way as you resented, as a student, you always resent what you're told to do. And I'm just going to end with one little anecdote. I mean, I found all of this upturned. I went to England as a student for the first time in my life, and I was 20 years old, and I arrived, I'd never left the country before, and I arrived in Cambridge, and I went to meet my director of studies, and he said, well, for the first term, all you're going to do is read Shakespeare. To me, it was like, well, not again. And he said, I hope that by the end of the term, you'll have read at least 20 Shakespeare plays, if not all 36. And I said, well, who am I going to be supervised by? And he said, well, we'll put you in the hands of Anne Barton, who at that time was 80 years old and the greatest living Shakespeare scholar. She was also the wife of John Barton, the Shakespeare director, who wrote one of the very best plays in Shakespeare, one of the very best books in Shakespeare. So I was trembling when I went to meet this greatest living Shakespeare in mind. And I was a 20-year-old shivering student who really had no clue about what he was doing at that stage. And the more I tried to impress Anne, the worse I wrote. But even that wasn't as bad as the fact that Anne had, I would go to see her in her rooms, and she had this huge library of Shakespeare books, practically everything that had ever been published. And she also had 3 pets. She lived by herself. She had 3 cats who were all named after Shakespeare actors of the 16th century. There was Kemp, there was Babbage, and there was a third one whom I've forgotten now. And I would sit across the table from her, and she would read the essay I'd submitted the day before, and she would say, well, why did you write that, and why did you say this? And I would try pitifully to explain why I had done so. And all the while, you'd hear these little tinkles going on all around you, and these cats had bells around their necks. And they would suddenly just come up and look you straight in the face as you were trying to say something sensible, and it was very disconcerting. And one day something really terrible happened, which is that I went to see Anne, she was seeing somebody else, I left the door open, and one of the cats ran out, it escaped. And Anne was really fond of her cats, and I knew right then, as I saw this cat run down the steps, that if I failed with this cat, I would never succeed with Shakespeare. And I ran all the way down with it, and I just caught it in time. They never left home, so they were a bit fat and a bit slothful. And I came up with it, and I saw Anne standing at the foot of the steps, at the top of the steps, saying, full marks to you. At which point I knew that I wouldn't get a fail for my course, and I would be all right.
Right, so among other global Shakespeares, you had a feline one also. I think it's time for us to take some questions from the audience, but if you guys wouldn't mind, I'd really just like to come back and perhaps end on, on a note of exquisite prose, and have Anjum read from Neti Neti, just perhaps a little bit. Give us a couple of minutes more.
Sorry to eat into your question time. I'm sure you have lots of questions, but I am dying to read a tiny bit from my second novel, Neti Neti. And this is a little different from the scene I was describing the first novel. Neti Neti is about a young girl called Sophie Das, and she lives in Shillong. She moves to Bangalore for work and pleasure and to discover herself. But her parents are back in Shillong, and her father is an absolute lover of Shakespeare, especially the play Hamlet. And I'm going to read a little scene where she's come back home after living on her own in this big city, and she's trying to talk to her father. Mr. Das paced about his old book-smelling room talking about Hamlet. He explained to Sophie, who had heard these very views stated in these very words countless times, how there was no play whose hero is sicker with life, and yet no play that as passionately embraces life's fundamental mysteries. No play so taken with death, and no play that does so little to redeem death's tragedy. No play that so mocks at love, and no play that so grieves over the death of the loss of a loved one. In other words, Hamlet had died, but the questions lived on. These conundrums were timeless. Sophie had never read Hamlet because her father had read it too much. There was nothing in his universe that could not be explained or illustrated with a quote from the play. This was an unbroken refrain running through her childhood. Words, 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 murder most foul, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Frailty, thy name is woman, give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. What's Hecuba to him, or him to Hecuba? Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Brevity is the soul of wit, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Mr. Das was now quoting the lines that Sophie, in keeping with some old ritual, was obliged to repeat along with him without being in the least bit touched by them, as if they were the chorus of an overplayed pop song or a prayer that's gone dead from overuse. Thus, conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought. And enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard, their current turn awry and lose the name of action. Sophie found, once she had dutifully recited this refrain, that she could not challenge her father. Even if Hamlet meant nothing to her, once the prince had been invoked, it was no longer answer it. Hamlet, once a bridge of affection between them, had now become a wall. Here, in her father's island of a room, she started to feel that her question was stupid because the answer to it so obvious. He had already cut himself adrift. His isolation was a slowly forming rock shelf made up of tin spoons and empty cartons of washing powder and scattered sheets with Hamlet's lines rewritten in Bengali. For the truth was that Mr. Das had been unhappy for a very long time. Like Hamlet, his despair was the most important thing about him. It had become his very nature, so his family had stopped noticing. Thanks. If anyone has any questions, we'd be happy.
Any questions?
Lovely Thursday morning, and 6 people on stage talking about Shakespeare. I think we've all died and gone to heaven, which meant probably that the guy at the gates who was checking this was St. Peter. I could have been nicer to him. But my question to this panel is, one of the great mysteries
of that question is it's actually a sign of Shakespeare's so about the Shakespeare controversy, I was in Russia and people were talking about it and they said this is the most despicable form of snobism. People have to believe that these plays were written by a lord. No one can believe they were written by a simple yeoman from Avon. But actually, a lot of the controversy is, how could he have known so much about other countries? He must have been someone who traveled a lot. And I think it's ridiculous, right? But I think the idea that there had to be someone who had this phenomenal degree of access to the world is a testimony to how much there is in Shakespeare's plays and how global they are.
Yeah, the guy who made a movie called 2012 actually made a movie about whether Shakespeare was in fact Shakespeare, which says a lot about the enduring popularity of it. If I may step into undergraduate mode for a moment, Jonathan Bates' The Genius of Shakespeare, which is a great sort of introduction to why Shakespeare is, to the genius of Shakespeare, has a great chapter on this called The Authorship Controversy, and reading that is probably one of the best potted histories of the controversy, as well as the definitive answer on, yes, it was Shakespeare who wrote Shakespeare. Bye. Sorry, anyone else?
Question, to be fair and clear, as I understand it, about which for me gets Shakespeare has lasted so long and is so much, and is because, and in this because he wasn't first and foremost a literary figure. He wasn't first and foremost a writer of great lines. He was a working writer. And I'm not saying this in any anti-intellectualism because I am an intellectual. Absolutely, the way I work is as an intellectual does. But he is a practical writer. And there lies, to me, the answer to the mystery. He wrote great stories in the form of theatre. In someone might make a table. But the thing is, that table is so magnificent. That table has glorious qualities. That table, we can study it as magical form. We can study it as history. We can study it as... And he makes great plays, and we enjoy them in the theatre. Those plays give us the answer to all mysteries.
The ambiguity has to do with our response needs. Is invite you to take beliefs that you do not hold. Now, one of the great things about art is that it asks of you simply to understand beliefs that you don't hold. We are able to have that sympathy only by loving people, like members of the family who turn out to vote the wrong way, or to believe the wrong religion, or to be macrobiotic food eaters. But we learn, so if we love them, know them, we are introduced to attain.